With sanction upon sanction beginning to mount up against Russia, the political and economic pressure is beginning to build. Until recently, that pressure was somewhat subdued by the fact that the world was still buying Russian oil and gas, meaning that cash was continuing to flow into Russian coffers. Not anymore. With the US announcing a ban on Russian oil and gas imports, and the possibility of Europe following suit, and even Russia itself cutting off supplies in retaliation, talks as a whole have turned to how countries will fill the gap left by Russia's departure from the international energy market. The US, for its part, has apparently turned to an unlikely destination: Venezuela. Whilst Venezuela and the US aren't exactly best buddies, to put it mildly, Venezuela may hold the key to the future of the conflict, both in terms of oil and politics. So let's explain how right now.
So far, we've released a ton of videos explaining and contextualizing the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So if you want to stay in the loop and understand the war around you, then be sure to subscribe. Currently, only about a quarter of you have, so we'd love your support.
On Tuesday, US President Joe Biden announced that America would be banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. This means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at US ports. Unlike other sanction packages, at the time of the announcement, the US acted alone, something Biden also acknowledged, saying that "we're moving forward, understanding that many of our European allies may not be in a position to join us. The US produces far more oil domestically than all of the European countries combined. In fact, we're a net exporter of energy, so we can take this step when others cannot." A matter of moments before, the UK announced that it would phase out the imports of Russian oil and other oil products, but only by the end of the year. Like the US, the UK doesn't rely particularly heavily on Russian gas. Those European countries that do rely on Russian gas, like Hungary and Germany, have been so far less keen on the idea, because it'll push their already sky-high energy costs even higher. In any case, the only way to A, get more countries to follow suit, and B, prepare for Russian retaliation in shutting down supplies, is to find alternative suppliers for the global economy, which is where Venezuela comes into play. Venezuela famously has the world's largest proven oil reserves and was, until recently, one of the world's most significant exporters of oil, at one point producing nearly 3 million barrels a day. Today, though, that figure is down over 60%, standing at just 1 million a day. The issue? Politics. The re-election of President Maduro in 2018 was called into question by a number of international observers, triggering a wave of condemnation from the US and her allies, who insisted the result was rigged. Soon afterwards, in 2019, the United States imposed major sanctions on Venezuelan oil, cut off domestic ties, and closed its embassy in Caracas. That all ultimately led to Maduro turning to the support of Cuba, China, and, you guessed it, Russia. Russian energy firms and banks have been said to be instrumental in ensuring that Venezuela can continue to export and sell oil, with Russia being the country's biggest source of foreign currency. Following the 2018 presidential election, the US recognized the leader of Venezuela's National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as acting president and introduced a UN Security Council motion calling for new presidential elections, which Russia promptly vetoed. So, in what appears to be an attempt to hit two birds with one stone, over the weekend, senior US officials, including the National Security Director for the Western Hemisphere, Juan Gonzalez, and US Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens, were sent to Caracas for talks with the Venezuelan government about potentially lifting some of those sanctions. This would be a big move. With oil prices at sky-high levels, removing sanctions would make sense for both the US and Venezuela. On the US side, as we've already discussed, successfully removing sanctions would not only reduce global dependence on Russian oil, it would also begin to peel Venezuela away from Russia, making it even more isolated on the global stage. Although Maduro has expressed strong support for the invasion and in mid-February pledged powerful military cooperation with Russia, Venezuela has apparently already backtracked on its support of Russia's invasion. Notably, Venezuela abstained at the United Nations on motions to condemn Russian aggression, with Maduro instead calling for a diplomatic solution to the crisis. It's also worth noting that following the high-level talks in Caracas, Secretary of State Blinken announced that 2 American citizens, Jorge Alberto Fernandez, detained since 2021 on spurious terrorism charges, and Gustavo Cadenas, one of the so-called Citgo 6 oil executives, would be returning home. Domestically for Venezuela, the move could be a huge boom for the otherwise embattled president Nicolas Maduro. For all intents and purposes, Venezuela is facing a humanitarian crisis. Since 2014, there has been an 8,000% increase in the number of Venezuelans seeking refuge status worldwide, with over 170,000 recognised refugees from Venezuela worldwide. In the words of UN High Commissioner for Refugees, people continue to leave Venezuela to escape violence, insecurity, and threats, as well as lack of food, medicine, and essential services. With over 5 million Venezuelans now living abroad, this has become one of the largest displacement crises in the world. While inflation in Venezuela has come down from its staggering 130,000% high in 2018, in 2021 it was still 686%. Unsurprisingly, Maduro isn't exactly the most popular guy around right now, and any respite would be a positive for him. Nonetheless, it wouldn't be politically easy for either Biden or Maduro. Maduro has spent the last few years lambasting the United States and accusing the US of orchestrating plots to undermine Venezuela, while the US is essentially swapping out one oil-rich strongman with another. Senate's Foreign Relations Committee Chair Bob Menendez stressed that the purchase of Venezuelan oil risks perpetuating a humanitarian crisis that has destabilized Latin America and the Caribbean for an entire generation, and other American politicians have expressed similar reservations. Republicans have started arguing that, instead of shouting at OPEC to raise output, trying to force a new Iran nuclear deal, which would loosen Iranian oil sanctions, or cozying up to Maduro, Biden should instead focus on domestic oil production via shale. While he hasn't said so explicitly, it's possible Biden is reluctant to do so because increasing domestic shale production doesn't look so good for his green credentials. But to be fair to Biden, shale producers have said that they won't be able to increase output immediately, and that any increase in production capacity would take several months. Nonetheless, Maduro has already signalled his desire to turn the page in America-Venezuela relations. Confirming the meeting with American diplomats, Maduro described it as respectful, cordial, and very diplomatic, further stressing that they had agreed to work on an agenda going forward. All in all, meaning that whilst relations between the US and Venezuela might be about to improve, it's difficult to call them anything like close allies. Just yet.
If you want more updates on issues like this, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Not only do we appreciate your support, but with only a quarter of you subscribed thus far, you could be missing out on further explainers and updates. So subscribe to better understand the war and the world around you.